Hello and welcome to the Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. Institute for Law Day 2021. I'm Thomas Raines with the Johnson Institute, and I am speaking to you from the Frank Johnson Courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama. This year's theme for Law Day is Advancing the Rule of Law Now. And keeping with that theme, I'm joined by three outstanding legal experts to discuss the importance of due process, a critical component of the rule of law and the role of law in our society. Due process is a term that you may have heard or you may be familiar with, but as you'll hear in a moment, it's a fundamental part of our legal system here in the United States. I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists. Dr. Elizabeth Bowles is the Law Magnet Instructor at the Center for Law at Booker T. Washington Magnet High School here in Montgomery. She is an attorney by training and clerked for Senior U.S. District Judge Keith Watkins, who is a founding board member of the Johnson Institute. Mr. Lane Heard is senior counsel at the law firm of Williams Connolly in Washington, D.C. A graduate of Yale, Cambridge, and Yale Law School, Mr. Heard is originally from Houston, Texas. He clerked for Judge Frank Johnson, the namesake of this organization, and I am pleased to say that Mr. Heard is an incoming board member for the Johnson Institute. And Mrs. Elizabeth Huntley is senior counsel and director of community relations and engagement at Lightfoot, Franklin & White in Birmingham, Alabama. A graduate of Auburn University and the University of Alabama School of Law, Mrs. Huntley is the author of More Than a Bird, her memoir of dealing with poverty and other issues as a child. And I would add that I am excited that Mrs. Huntley is also joining the board of the Johnson Institute. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you for being with us and sharing your expertise in honor of Law Day. Lane, I'd like to start with you. For the students who are watching this, who may be unfamiliar with the idea of due process, can you explain what due process is?
Be glad to. The Constitution, of course, says that no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And by that, it means that no one will be deprived of their life or their liberty or their property without fair procedures. Process means procedures, and it means that this enormous power that the government has to execute people or to incarcerate people or to take their property can't be done unless there's some basic procedural protections for everyone. So due process means two different things, but first and foremost, it means having these procedures in place, and there are some very basic procedures that are guaranteed by the Constitution. You're entitled to notice. If the government wants to put you in jail, you're entitled to know what the charges are. You're entitled to have an impartial judge. You're entitled to know what the evidence is that's going to be put against you. You're entitled to present evidence of your own and have a lawyer present that evidence for you. You're entitled to cross-examine a witness that would testify and to put on your own witnesses. And at the end of the day, you're entitled to have this impartial judge put reasons in writing for how he's come to the decision that he's come to. And that whole collection of protections, procedural protections, constitute the most important kind of due process. But there is a second kind. It's a much smaller part of the law, but in some ways no less important, because the Supreme Court has recognized that some rights are so very important, even though they're not named in the Constitution, that they are protected by due process. For example, the right to privacy, the right to control the education of one's own children, the right to marry someone of a different race or the right to marry someone of the same sex. All of those important landmark decisions of the Supreme Court have rested, at least in part, on something called due process.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Liz, I'd like to turn to you. Can you tell us a little bit more on that topic? Why does due process matter? Is this something that's unique to Americans?
We own a lot of things in America, but we don't own due process. Due process is rooted, the American version of it at least, is rooted in in English law and afforded to all the states of the United States of America, including Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico used America's form of due process, even though they're not a state in the United States of America. So our form that we use is unique to us, but similar in nature to other places around the world, because it's so fundamental, right? You know, unless you live in a nation where the rights of individuals aren't recognized and it's not truly a democracy, true democracy can't exist without individual rights and freedoms. And so with that said, it's something that we share with other nations across the world and learned as we were a baby nation from other nations across the world. I will just say, in terms of why it's important, it is so important because just imagine, if you will, if somebody could tell you that you could go, let's put it in your language. If somebody said, you know what, you can bring a backpack to school, but you can only bring a black backpack, a yellow backpack, and a blue backpack. So regardless of what kind of style you want, and it can only be an Adidas backpack. And, you know, and I know that sounds really silly because we're talking about backpacks, but it's kind of the fundamental premise, right? You know, where the state or the government might tell you that you have to do things a certain way and you don't have a right to be able to pursue those things in the way. And that goes to some of the fundamental rights that the Supreme Court has recognized, as my colleague just spoke about. So when you have a right to make certain choices for yourself, you have a right to understand why the school is saying that you have to bring one of those three colors of a backpack. You have a right to question those things. I mean, and it's a simple analogy, but I just wanted to share that to kind of bring it in your world and in your terms. It's about having your fundamental rights.
Thanks. Dr. Bowles, you have experience as both an attorney and now as a teacher. Can you tell us how you talk about due process with your students? How do they come to understand what it is?
I will have to say, I think that's probably one of the most fun things I can talk to students about. And they love 14th Amendment cases and Fifth Amendment cases, which these are amendments that deal with due process, because no one understands due process inherently in their gut better than a teenager. Because what does a teenager want? They want to be treated fairly, which is what Mr. Heard was talking about procedural due process. They want to know what's required of them, which is the notice, and they want to have an opportunity to tell their side if they get in trouble, which is the opportunity to be heard. That's procedural due process in a nutshell. And all of the procedures that go into whatever is legally required of procedure, it boils down to, do you have notice of what's expected of you and why the government is taking your right away? And have you been given an opportunity to be heard that is meaningful? Not like, oh, you have to be on this call, but we didn't tell you about the call until 30 minutes after it happened. They get that. They get fundamental fairness. And they also get the idea of substantive due process. They already walk in my classroom knowing about it, because I think right now, as I look at my seniors and they are about to graduate, and some of my students who have just turned 17 that want to join the military, they get more than anybody else that you are not really free until you can make decisions about what are you going to do when you graduate? What job are you going to have? Where are you going to live? Who do you want to marry? Do you want to marry somebody of the same race? What gender person are you attracted to? Those are all things that they are in the process of just about to be able to make for themselves. And they're still legally under their parents' wings, but they know that they will have their freedom when they can make those choices. And they also know that's a lot of responsibility, because they're about to run smack into those responsibilities and living with the consequences, good and bad, of the choices they make. So they get it. They get substantive and procedural due process. It's just a matter of explaining how that works in the law and how those terms play out. And one of the things I do with that, our freshmen every year in my program, I teach a program that trains students to be ready to be in the legal services field. So they can graduate from my program and become a legal secretary right out of high school, or they can go on to law school and college and go through that route. But one of the things we do our freshman year is we brief a case called Loving versus Virginia, which was the case where there was a couple who lived in Virginia who the man was white and the lady was black, and it was illegal for them to get married in Virginia in the middle of the last century. Even though slavery had been outlawed 100 years before they wanted to get married, they were not free. So just because you're not a slave on a plantation and chained does not mean you're free. You are not truly free, as students understand, if you can't make your choices about what you're going to do with the time that's given to you on in this earth. You know, technically you're not a slave, but it's not a free society if you don't have that. And they get that. And we talk about that, and we talk about how this couple got their rights to get married and what they did to break ground on that, and why it was important for them to live in their state and not move. And we watched the movie called Loving after we briefed the case. But it's a really good vehicle to talk about everything from due process, natural law, all of those things come into that case. But at the heart, it's really just taking what teenagers already know for themselves and putting legal terminology on it.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Liz, is there a difference in how due process is interpreted in different kinds of cases, whether, for example, civil cases or criminal cases in the law?
Yeah, so let me just, for the listeners that may not know what criminal versus civil, it is as it sounds, right? So criminal cases involve crimes, involve somebody being accused of a crime, and there's a certain type of due process associated with criminal cases. And then civil cases are cases that are all cases that aren't crimes. That's the best way and the simplest way to describe it. Those would be things like divorce cases. Those would be things like people fussing over a landline, saying, this is my property, this is your property. Those are disputes between citizens, and they go to civil court to resolve those disputes and get a judgment. So because of the very nature of those things, they call for different kinds of due process, all rooted in fundamental fairness, all rooted in the right to have a fair process to be heard and to resolve your matter. But for criminal law, the fair process is more based on the axiom in America, which is you're innocent until proven guilty, right? And so there are protections in place that sort of protects that fundamental idea. Whereas in a civil matter, you have somebody that raises an issue and files a complaint. That's a regular citizen that would file that complaint, and then or business or whoever. And then you have somebody that responds, and you've got two sides saying I'm right and the other side, no, I'm right. And there's a dispute between them. So that calls for a bunch of different rules that are going to guide how they're going to handle that dispute. Putting them on notice that they're saying in the civil context, putting them on notice that they have a disagreement with somebody and think they've been wronged or whatever. Then they have the person that they filed against it have a chance to respond to them within a certain amount of time after they've been put on notice. And then they have an opportunity to reply to that response, and so on and so forth. So there's a structure that guides a way for a judge to get to the bottom of that dispute between those two parties, with fairness being weighted on both sides for their opportunity to present their case. Whereas in the criminal context, you're talking about losing your liberty and your freedom potentially, depending on the nature of the crime a person's being accused of. So there's somewhat of a heightened level of process to make sure that a person's individual rights are being protected, particularly since it is guided under the presumption that they're innocent until proven guilty.
Thank you. So diving a little bit deeper, Lane, can you give us an example of a situation where a defendant was not given due process, or perhaps where the idea of due process was unpopular from the beginning of a case or before a case started?
Well, I think I could give you more than 4,000 examples. For those of you who live in Montgomery, for those of you who've been to Montgomery and have been to the Memorial for Peace and Justice, you've seen the 800 Corten monuments that represent the 800 counties in which more than 4,000 African Americans were lynched between the end of Reconstruction and 1950. That's the quintessential example of a lack of due process. No charges, no evidence, no chance to defend yourself, no rights, just taken out and killed. I mean, if we talk about instances where it's been unpopular to provide due process, many of you will have read To Kill a Mockingbird. Not at all popular for Atticus Finch to represent Tom Robinson and provide a defense and provide reasons why he may be innocent, and to provide cross-examination of the witnesses against Tom Robinson. And if we come to the current day, it's been exceedingly unpopular to provide due process to those alleged terrorists who've been held at Guantanamo since 2001, 2002. Scores of individuals held without trial for 2 decades. So this isn't a problem just of the past. It's due process isn't always popular, and it's never popular when there are unpopular or minority groups involved.
Thank you. Liz, the same question to you. Examples of where due process has not been given or where it was unpopular?
I've got to agree with my colleague here in that, you know, there's so many examples, and that's unfortunate. There's so many examples of where it hasn't been given, which is why it's so heavily litigated. But I would like to draw attention to one that's very recent as this week or last week, or, you know, over the last month. And that is point to the George Floyd trial. You know, those of us who are legal nerds have been somewhat glued to, when we should be working, what's going on in that trial. And there's several facets of that trial that would deal with this, but there's one in particular that deals with one of our cornerstones of due process in the Fifth Amendment, which is the right to not incriminate yourself. And by incriminate yourself, meaning to say something or tell something about yourself that could later get you in trouble with the law. And the passenger that was in the car with George Floyd prior to his death was asked to come and testify about what was going on between him and George Floyd leading up to the time of his death, which would have revealed some drug use, which would have revealed him providing drugs and some other things that might have been self-incriminating for him. And if you watched any of that, you will know that what he did with his lawyer was that, I plead the fifth. And you've heard people say, I plead the fifth, I plead the fifth. Well, what they mean by that is they take the right to be silent and to not state something that can be used against them. And so there was a vibrant exchange between the lawyers over whether or not this gentleman had the right to assert the Fifth Amendment in those instances. And ultimately, the judge made the decision that he could assert his Fifth Amendment rights and that they were appropriate for the testimony that he was being asked to give. But it's a true modern day version, again, about why those fundamental rights of due process are so important.
That's right. And Elizabeth, I'd like to turn to you for a related question. Sometimes we hear the term due process used outside the courtroom. Why and what does that mean? And are people talking about the same thing as the term inside the courtroom?
You know, I'm not really 100% sure of what everybody means when they say that word, but I do think at the core of it, it kind of gets back to what I was saying a minute ago. People have a sense of fundamental fairness. It's sort of built into us as humans that live in a society. And they say due process, maybe misusing the term or using it too broadly. But I think at the core, when you hear somebody say that, what they're saying is it wasn't fair. Either I wasn't treated fairly in the way I wasn't heard, I wasn't given an opportunity to know what was expected of me, or maybe my fundamental choices have been taken away. And so, to my knowledge, I haven't really seen it be used, even if it's not technically correct, that in such a different way that it doesn't really get at something about the theme of what due process stands for. But if I'm misunderstanding the question, please let me know. You may be thinking of another example of how people use it than what I'm thinking of.
No, that is great. Thank you. And Lane, I'd like to turn back to you for just a second. And you've given us some very powerful examples of the lack of due process. But I want to ask explicitly, what's the risk of not allowing for due process in a situation? And I say that in terms of legal matters, but you may want to speak more broadly than that.
Well, I think the great risk is that the government simply has enormous power. And if that power can be exercised arbitrarily, then people are at great risk. And due process is that fundamental guarantee that we're not going to allow these basic protections to be eroded. Because the danger is always that we'll cut corners on due process in an emergency or in times of stress, times of war. So we look back to the last century, and it's World War II, and we're at war with the Japanese. Well, due process protections go out the window for Japanese Americans, and they're herded up on the West Coast, and they're put in concentration camps. And the greater public says, well, but we're in a war and these people are at risk to us. And so, it's not going to happen to us. And in the last 20 years, since 9/11, we've been engaged in a war on terror, and we've incarcerated individuals in Guantanamo and denied them basic due process protections. And the temptation is to say, well, it's a period of great threat, and these people represent a threat, and they're not like us. And if we deny them due process, it's not going to affect us. But once the erosion of the protections begin, there's no telling where it stops. And so the great danger is to look the other way or to make excuses when it happens, because it's the other, it's somebody else. It's not the people like us who are being denied these protections. And once that begins, it's from the time of the founding fathers, that's been seen as a very, very dangerous thing.
Thank you. I want to ask the other panelists, any further comments on that, on the danger of not allowing due process?
I would just say, particularly as an African American, and because vestiges of racism still exist even today as we sit here in 2021, it's certainly critical, to African Americans that the due process exists in this country, and that we protect due process rights, because what it does is, if you don't have those due process rights, it's sort of like what my colleague Lane said. You open the door for people to have, and I use the term nefarious, and what I'm talking about, for people to have, bad intentions in terms of the rights that they're restricting when they're really trying to do something bad towards people. And I'm just trying to put it in your terms as students. And so, if they're doing things that are bad towards people and they're chipping away at their fundamental fairness rights, then it opens the door for them to chip more and chip more. And it reverts people back into a place of of things just not being fundamentally fair. I love that Elizabeth keeps talking about fundamental fairness, because that's what this is all about. It's about things being fundamentally fair and equal to all people.
Thank you. There is so much around due process that we could talk about, and we're just about out of time for this interview. But in honor of Law Day, I'd like to ask each of you if you could tell us what or who inspired you to become a lawyer. And Liz, I'd like to start with you.
Well, it was kind of a collective of people, and I'll tell you why. When I was in the 6th grade, my history teacher asked me. He stopped me one day, and I grew up in a background where I was in poverty and foster homes and, parents, drug dealers, all of that stuff, just a very tough childhood, but I was a good student. And my history teacher told me one day, he stopped me after class, and I always read all the time, but I read crazy, scary books. And he asked me, why did I always read that crap? And, and I asked him why. And he basically said, Elizabeth, you have a lot of potential. You need to read biographies. You need to read about ordinary people doing amazing things. And I didn't understand that at the time, but what he was doing, he didn't know how to communicate with me to help me, but wanted to, but saw that I loved to read. So he encouraged me to go read these biographies about people in hopes that I might be inspired. And boy, was he right. And so I went to the library and I perused through the books, and I went to the African-American section. And so I started with Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And I started reading about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and, all of these icons of African-American history that were in the library. And I started to notice one thing. Even when I read all the Black folks, I started reading the white folks about Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln and Helen Keller and all those folks. But what was consistent throughout every bit of those agents of change, people that really made an impact on society, was this sort of underlying notion of the law being involved, of the law helping move the needle, of the law being the mechanism for making change and helping people. And so it was from reading those biographies that I decided I want to be a lawyer. I want to be a part of that profession where change happens. I want to be a part of that profession where my skill set can be used to help make a difference for people. And so, because it was quite evident in reading those biographies that it did. So there in the 6th grade year of school, I decided I want to be a lawyer, and I haven't looked back, and I have absolutely no regrets.
Elizabeth, what about you? You've obviously changed. You're now in the education world.
I know we are short on time. Mine is kind of a long journey. I have always just had a really gut. I guess that as a young person, I too felt that sense of fundamental fairness. And as you get older and you go, the world is just not. It's broken, and it can, you have that idealism. I wanted to be a teacher, and I kind of applied to law school as a backup and got a full ride to law school. But the reason I did that was because in my undergraduate background in environmental science, I had come to the conclusion that no matter how good of a scientist I was, that the real change to save the environment lay in the law. And I had also, lived through personally with my own family situation, things where I had seen the legal system be misused and power be abused politically and legally. And I was like, the law is really where that change is. So I would agree with Ms. Huntley on that, and again, it gets back to due process. The law is the process that we set out for getting, having your rights adjudicated and saying what those rights are. And I think that if you really, really want to change, put your finger on something and move the needle on something you care about, the law is one really, really good way to do it.
That's great. Thank you, Lane.
I think my story is a short one. My dad was a lawyer. He came on with good stories. And I think I absorbed 2 lessons from listening to the stories. One was, as a lawyer, sometimes you're on the side of the angels and you're pursuing justice, and that's exciting. And sometimes you're on the other side and you're not on the side of the angels. But if you play your role effectively and honestly, you are ensuring that the system works, and you're holding the system to account, and you're making the system be honest. So to use today's language, you're ensuring that due process is protected and that everybody is treated fairly. And I think the fundamental belief in our system is that when the process works, and when both sides in a courtroom are treated fairly, we come to good outcomes.
Thank you so much, and thank you to each of you for taking the time to speak with us today. Watching this are students who are preparing to graduate either this year or in the next couple of years. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with them? It's open to any of you.
I would say I wish you the best. I'm going to go ahead and answer this one as a teacher. I have seen you this year. I've seen students who have overcome incredible obstacles just to get their hands on their education. And if you've made it through this year, then you know there is nothing that can hold you back. There are no excuses. You know how to overcome odds. Please keep doing that. I see in your generation people who do care, people who understand that when somebody who's not like me is mistreated, that does affect me. I see students who are fired up and they want to change the world, and hang on to that. And don't let, the world is going to be tough when you get out there, but don't let it change the core of that belief in who you are, and make a difference where you can, even if it's in a small way. So congratulations to you, young people, and I wish you the best.
Well, I guess I'd say, drawing on the last week of news, that we know there's a great deal of injustice in the world and in this country, but people of goodwill can make the system work. And we saw that in Minneapolis. It doesn't mean that the work is over. It just means the work is worth pursuing because it can achieve justice.
And I would just say in closing that you define you, like you define who you want to be. Don't allow environment, circumstances, challenges define what's in your heart about who you want to be, and explore. It may not be law, but always I'm going to piggyback off of Elizabeth again, but always know that no matter what role you have in society, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a person that works and builds cars every day or fixes cars or whatever it is that you do that makes you happy, because it's that thing that makes you happy, you're still a citizen of this country. And you still have a voice. That we operate in a democracy that thrives off of the voice of the citizen. And so you are always engaged. I think we're all lawyers to some extent, because we're all sort of officers of protecting our rights as citizens here in this country. And so, practice your law every day, regardless of whatever professional hat that you wear.
Well, it has been an honor to speak with each of you today, and the Johnson Institute is excited to recognize Law Day 2021 and its theme, Advancing the Rule of Law Now. For those of you watching, you can learn more about due process and many other topics at the website for the Judge Johnson Institute at www.thejohnsoninstitute.org. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you will join us again.